Edgar Cayce, often called the sleeping prophet, remains one of history's most fascinating and well-documented clairvoyants. Between 1901 and 1944, he delivered more than 14,000 trance readings while in a self-induced sleep state, each meticulously transcribed by stenographers. What made Cayce extraordinary was not mere intuition, but the precision of his visions. He foresaw both world wars, the 1929 stock market crash, and even described future technologies such as wireless communication and medical scanning decades before their invention. Unlike many seers, Cayce grounded his prophecies in deep spirituality. A devoted Christian, he viewed his gift as a channel of divine wisdom rather than personal power. His readings ranged from healing the sick to predicting the rise and fall of nations, all united by a theme of karma, balance, and human evolution. Scientists and spiritual researchers at the Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach continue to study his archives, fascinated by how so many of his insights have unfolded with uncanny accuracy. For many, Cayce's work stands as evidence that humanity's future is not random, that time, consciousness, and destiny are intertwined in ways we are only beginning to understand. Edgar Cayce spoke of a period he called the Great Change, a defining test in America's destiny. In his readings, he foresaw a time when the nation would be shaken not only by economic instability, but also by deep moral and social fragmentation. He described this era as one of profound reckoning, when the very ideals upon which the country was built would be questioned and redefined. Central to this upheaval, Cayce mentioned the rise of a divisive leader, a figure who would both unite and divide the people, embodying the nation's own inner conflict. He also referred to a mysterious return around the year 2026, signaling a karmic turning point, a moment when America would be forced to confront its choices and values. This return was not only political but spiritual, representing the resurfacing of unresolved lessons from the past. Cayce hinted that through turmoil and confrontation, hidden truths would surface, forcing citizens to see beyond illusion and rediscover their collective purpose. The Great Reckoning, as he called it, would thus serve as both a crisis and an opportunity, a time when America could either collapse under division or awaken to a higher moral and spiritual consciousness. In his famous reading 3976-26, 1944, Edgar Cayce offered one of his most symbolically charged prophecies. He spoke of a leader known as the Builder, a man surrounded by towers and gold who would rise during a time of great turmoil. To Cayce, this figure represented not only material ambition, but also the struggle between spiritual truth and worldly power. Modern interpreters have often connected this imagery to Donald Trump, whose identity and legacy are deeply tied to gilded skyscrapers, wealth, and the promise to rebuild a declining nation. Cayce's mention of a shift in the poles was long thought to refer to literal earth changes, yet many researchers now interpret it as a metaphor for political and moral realignment, the extreme polarization dividing America. This shift, he suggested, would threaten the nation's stability and reveal the deeper fractures in its soul. In this turbulent environment, the Builder would emerge both as a catalyst and a test, reflecting humanity's obsession with material success and its neglect of spiritual balance. Cayce implied that only through this confrontation could the nation rediscover its higher purpose, turning chaos into a moment of awakening rather than collapse. In his prophetic vision of America's future, Edgar Cayce foresaw that the rise of the Builder, a leader symbolizing ambition, material strength, and national pride, would not bring the stability people expected. Instead, he warned that this leader's second term would unfold under the weight of three great crises, each testing a different pillar of the nation: its economy, its environment, and its democracy. These trials, he said, would not appear separately but in close succession, creating a perfect storm that would expose the fragility of what humanity had built upon false foundations. The first crisis, according to Cayce, would strike the economic realm. He described it as a disintegration of false foundations, a collapse of systems sustained by illusion, greed, and unsustainable debt. This downfall, he said, would be sudden, a shock no one anticipated, triggered by the unraveling of global trade alliances and reckless financial policies. Modern interpreters link this warning to a potential trade war or monetary disruption caused by protectionist measures and inflated markets. Cayce seemed to suggest that this economic breakdown would not merely be a financial event, but a spiritual reflection, the outer manifestation of inner corruption. When nations build their wealth on exploitation and ego, he taught, the laws of karma demand balance. The year 2026 in his timeline represented that moment of economic reckoning when false prosperity would give way to painful truth. The second crisis Cayce predicted was environmental, and his words carry an eerie resonance with today's climate warnings. He spoke of the east coast of America facing water-related disasters, floods, hurricanes, and the sea reclaiming what man has built. He implied that these events would intensify not through divine punishment, but through humanity's neglect of natural law. The more mankind sought domination over nature, the more violently the earth would respond. In his readings, Cayce often connected environmental disturbances with moral imbalance, suggesting that human behavior, greed, exploitation, and disregard for the planet could manifest physically as storms, quakes, and floods. Seen through today's lens, this part of his prophecy seems hauntingly plausible. Rising sea levels, severe weather, and environmental deregulation have already placed the U.S. East Coast at risk. Cayce's message, however, was not one of doom, but of consequence. He taught that nature mirrors humanity's collective consciousness. When people lose harmony with spiritual law, the earth itself seeks to restore it. Thus, the environmental turmoil of 2026 would not only test America's infrastructure, but its capacity for humility and stewardship. Would the nation finally learn to live in balance with creation or continue the cycle of denial and destruction? The third and final crisis Cayce envisioned was the most perilous, a constitutional and moral crisis that would challenge the very soul of American democracy. He foresaw a time when the government's branches would collide, when institutions would no longer trust one another and the rule of law itself would hang in uncertainty. The leader, Cayce said, would resist limits on his authority, claiming to act in the nation's best interest while deepening division. This would lead to what he termed civil strife, a period when Americans would be forced to choose between comfort and conscience, between the illusion of order and the preservation of liberty. Today, this prophecy feels unsettlingly relevant. Cayce's constitutional crisis mirrors the growing distrust in elections, institutions, and media. He suggested that this confrontation was karmic, that America, once a beacon of freedom, would have to decide whether it truly believed in the principles it preached. During this trial, Cayce said, both sides would be shocked by the outcome, implying that truth would emerge in unexpected ways, exposing hypocrisy and corruption across all political lines. Together, these three crises, economic, environmental, and constitutional, form the triad of America's reckoning. Cayce saw them not as random disasters, but as spiritual catalysts, forcing humanity to confront its imbalance. The builder leader would become both symbol and mirror, embodying the nation's desire for greatness, but also its shadow, greed, denial, and division. Whether this period ends in collapse or awakening, Cayce left the outcome open, reminding that prophecy is not fate, it is warning. If America heeds the lessons beneath the chaos, the great change could become the foundation for renewal. But if it ignores them, the disintegration he foresaw will not only reshape a nation, it will redefine what it means to be human in the face of truth. Edgar Cayce's prophecy of the judgment of the builders stands among his most profound and symbolically rich predictions. In his vision, this judgment was not simply about political accountability, but a moral and spiritual reckoning for those who built their power upon deception, greed, or ego. The builders, he said, would face the collapse of their own creations, towers of influence and authority that no longer aligned with truth. This trial would arrive when false foundations could no longer sustain themselves, forcing leaders to confront the very shadows they had ignored. Modern interpreters see striking parallels between this prophecy and Donald Trump's ongoing legal and ethical challenges, which may culminate around 2026, the year Cayce identified as a national turning point. The image of the builder fits uncannily, a man of towers, gold, and ambition now facing the test of justice. Cayce implied that this judgment would not only concern one individual, but reflect the collective karma of a nation, revealing how power has been used or abused. The outcome, he hinted, would surprise both supporters and critics alike. Ultimately, the judgment of the builders symbolizes a divine rebalancing, a moment when truth rises, illusions fall, and the moral structure of leadership is forever changed. Throughout his later readings, Edgar Cayce often emphasized the number 26, a symbol he linked to great turning points in human destiny. In the context of America's future, he connected this number to a crossroads for democracy, a moment when the nation would be forced to choose between spiritual evolution and moral decline. Researchers have long noted how Cayce referred to 26 not merely as a date or number, but as a vibrational marker representing transformation through trial. In this cycle, he suggested, the United States would confront the true meaning of freedom, whether it serves the higher good or becomes enslaved to power and control. Cayce warned that around this time, now interpreted as 2026, humanity would face the temptation to trade liberty for security, drifting toward authoritarianism under the illusion of protection. Yet he also said this same period carried the potential for awakening if people acted from conscience rather than fear. The number 26, therefore, signifies both peril and possibility, the test of a civilization's soul. Will America evolve into a society guided by higher consciousness and compassion, or fall into division and dominance? Cayce's prophecy frames 2026 as the defining moment when that choice must finally be made. Edgar Cayce's teaching on returning souls adds a deeply spiritual dimension to his prophecies. He believed that certain influential figures, especially leaders, are reincarnated at pivotal moments in history to complete unfinished karmic lessons. These souls, he said, return not by accident but by cosmic design, drawn back into positions of power when humanity reaches a moral crossroads. Their purpose is to mirror the consciousness of the people, to reveal what a nation has learned and what it still refuses to face. Cayce suggested that America's destiny would depend on how it responds to one such polarizing returning soul. This leader would not merely govern, he would act as a spiritual mirror, exposing the nation's virtues and flaws alike. Some would see him as a savior, others as a destroyer, but in truth, he would be both teacher and test. The collective reaction to his rise and actions would determine whether the country advances toward enlightenment or sinks deeper into division. In Cayce's view, the returning soul's karma is intertwined with the nation's own, and through that confrontation, both are offered a chance for redemption. How America meets that challenge, he warned, will reveal its spiritual maturity and its readiness for renewal. In one of his most vivid prophecies, Edgar Cayce described the rise of a great storm sweeping across the east coast of America. A vision, he said, carried both literal and symbolic meaning. On the surface, it represented powerful natural disasters, hurricanes, floods, and destructive tempests striking major cities. Yet beneath that imagery lay a deeper truth. The storm as a symbol of moral and political upheaval, the chaos born when a nation strays too far from spiritual law. Cayce warned that this turbulence would shake the foundations of leadership and expose the imbalance between power and conscience. At the center of this storm stood a leader, tied to towers and gold, an unmistakable archetype of material ambition and self-made success. But Cayce foresaw that this figure would face forces beyond his control, events that no wealth, authority, or strategy could contain. The storm, he said, would strip away illusion, revealing truth and testing integrity. For this leader, it would mark the beginning of revelation and judgment, not only of his actions, but of the nation's soul reflected through him. Cayce's vision implies that only by enduring this purging storm can America rediscover its spiritual grounding and emerge renewed from its own reckoning. Amid visions of turmoil and collapse, Edgar Cayce also foresaw a powerful spiritual awakening unfolding in the mid-2020s. He spoke of a time when ordinary people would begin to see behind the veil, perceiving truth beyond the distortions of politics, media, and fear. This awakening, he said, would not come through leaders or institutions, but through the collective consciousness of humanity, a rising inner light spreading through minds and hearts worldwide. Cayce even hinted that technology itself, though once a tool of distraction, would become an instrument of revelation, allowing hidden truths to surface and connect souls across great distances. In his view, the true battle of 2026 would not be political, but spiritual. Humanity would divide into two paths, those ruled by fear, clinging to control and illusion, and those guided by awareness, compassion, and faith in a higher order. This was the essence of the Great Change, not destruction, but transformation. Cayce believed that through crisis, humanity would awaken to its divine potential, realizing that every collapse of the outer world serves to awaken the inner one. Thus, amid chaos, he saw not an ending, but the beginning of a new consciousness, the dawn of truth arising from the heart of struggle. In Edgar Cayce's final vision of America's destiny, the year 2026 stands as a crossroads between illusion and truth, a moment when the nation must confront the spiritual consequences of its choices. He described it as a time when the towers of pride and power would begin to fall, not merely as physical symbols, but as representations of false values built on ego, greed, and division. This collapse, Cayce said, would not signify destruction, but awakening, the dismantling of illusions that have long blinded humanity from its higher nature. At this threshold, America and the world faces a profound test to choose between shadow and light, between living through fear or through spirit. The events of 2026, he suggested, would strip away deception and compel collective reflection, revealing that material success without moral grounding cannot endure. Yet Cayce also foresaw a rebirth of truth, a renewal emerging from the ashes of disillusionment. As the towers fall, understanding rises, a new consciousness that values compassion, integrity, and unity over domination. In this way, 2026 marks not an ending, but the beginning of renewal, when humanity rediscovers the sacred balance between power and purpose, ego and soul.